Missiles? How do they work? Well, let's take a look at air-to-air missiles in War Thunder. So up front, this guide is going to look at air-to-air missiles available to fixed-wing aircraft in War Thunder, the keybinds you need, and how to use them in combat. We're not going to go into any of the helicopter stuff, but most of the basic concepts still apply. This video is geared towards absolute beginners, and I'm going to do my best to explain this stuff from scratch, but even advanced players might find some useful information here. Or at least a bunch of minutia they can nitpick and actually down in the comments. We're going to go through each type of missile one at a time, but not every individual missile within each type because that would be 6 hours. First up, let's look at a missile stat card and understand the terms. These examples are the AIM-9E and R3R. The mass indicates how heavy the weapon is. Guidance tells you how the missile finds its target. Aspect is the direction you can attack the target from. Semi-active radar missiles will also list the signal type, usually pulse or continuous wave. Lock-on range is how far away you can get a weapons lock, but it is not how far away you can shoot the weapon. Launch range is similarly not how far away you can shoot the weapon in practice. Missile range is a tremendously complicated topic, I know that, so don't rip me up in the comments over it. But the oversimplified way to think of it is that the launch range is how far the weapon can fly through the air from the point at which it was fired. Maximum speed is how fast the missile is traveling after its full burn. Max overload is basically how hard the missile can turn. Max overload during launch is how hard you can be turning when you fire the weapon. If you're going harder than this, it just won't fire. Missile guidance time is how long the weapon will track the target. Explosive type, mass, and TNT equivalent are data about the strength of the warhead. If the stat card of the missile you're looking at in-game is missing some of those stats, don't worry. A few of them haven't been updated in-game to, display all of the info. Blame the snail. The first type of air-to-air missile are manually command line-of-sight guided weapons. This example is the AA-20 Nord. Manually guided weapons need a set of keybinds to control them. You literally steer the missile into the target by hand using some keybinds. In practice, these weapons can be quite difficult to use, and out in real life, they were phased out of service very quickly. To fire the weapon, you simply use your keybind for Fire Air-to-Air Missile. After the missile is outbound, you use your keybinds for Yaw and Pitch axis for aimed weapons. I would strongly suggest turning off the option for relative control. To hit a target, you really do just steer the missile in manually. Here's an example from live gameplay. Next up are semi-automatic command line-of-sight guided missiles, also known simply as beam riding radar guidance. The example here is the Fire Flash missile. Beam riding guidance works by having a sensor in the back of the missile which detects the radar beam coming from your aircraft. Your plane locks its radar directly forwards, and the missile steers itself to try and stay in the center of your plane's radar beam, allowing you to guide the missile manually by steering your aircraft. This can also be somewhat difficult, and like the manual command line-of-sight weapons, beam riding weapons weren't used in real life for very long. The only keybind you need is Fire Air-to-Air Missile. As soon as the weapon is launched, it will steer itself and stay in the center of your radar beam. But keep in mind that the missile isn't a UFO and can't turn very well. So if you steer your plane too quickly, the weapon will lose its tracking and be wasted. A special note, if you lock on to a beam riding missile, it will go crazy and fly off in a random direction. War Thunder will let you get a radar lock on missiles in flight, but don't do that. If your plane has a radar gun sight, turn it off when you fire, because tracking your missile with the radar gun sight as it flies away from the plane will count as a radar lock for these purposes, and it'll fly off crazy. Here's an example of using a beam riding weapon from live gameplay. Next up are infrared guided missiles, and this is where things start to get a little complicated. First, let's talk about how IR missiles work. Basic IR missiles use a passive sensor to detect, track, and lock infrared radiation primarily from the engine exhaust of the target. You generally need to have some visibility to the target's engine heat in order for all this to work, and the basic heat-seeking missiles are generally called rear aspect because you need to be behind the target. More advanced infrared missiles actually use an actively cooled seeker head to boost the sensitivity and allow target detection without needing direct visibility towards the engine exhaust. These are called all-aspect missiles because they can be fired from all directions on the target. Early generation IR missiles tend to have what is called a caged seeker. This means that the actual part inside the missile that detects the infrared radiation is mounted facing directly forward and has a fixed cone of detection in front of the missile. Please ignore the crappy diagrams here. Later IR missiles have what is called an uncaged seeker. This means that the detector is mounted on some kind of a gimbal so it can aim itself and see things that might not be directly in front of the missile. This helps get an initial target lock and helps maintain a lock after firing on a target that is trying to dodge out of the way. Some advanced IR missiles can also use a feature called slaving, if they're carried by a plane with a compatible radar set. What this does is it allows the plane's radar to send commands to the missile when the radar locks a target, telling the missile where to aim its uncaged seeker. It won't allow the missile to lock on in any situation that it wouldn't otherwise be able to lock on, but it makes it easier to get an initial missile target lock in a turning fight, and can make sure that you lock the correct target if there are several to choose from. Note that this only helps you get a target lock and does not actually help guide the missile after it's fired. First, let's look at a basic IR missile and how to use it. We're going to start with the AIM-9B, which is a rear aspect missile with a caged seeker. In order to use an IR missile, first you need to turn the weapon on. This is called spooling up the missile, and you can do this by hitting your keybind for Fire Air-to-Air Missile. A gray circle will show up out in front of your plane and start blinking slowly. This indicates that your weapon's electronics are turning on and activating the infrared seeker. You'll also get an audio tone. After a couple of seconds, the circle blinks differently and the missile is now looking for a target. Maneuver so that the target's engine exhaust is inside the circle until it turns red. Then press your Fire Air-to-Air Missile keybind again to launch the weapon. If you wait too long, the missile will turn itself off and will need to be spooled up again. Keep in mind that caged seeker missiles are generally pretty basic and can be easy to dodge. Sometimes even gentle maneuvering will be enough to evade one of these weapons. For a caged seeker infrared missile, that's all there is to it. Here's an example from live gameplay. Next up is a slightly more advanced infrared missile, one with an uncaged seeker. When you spool up the missile, you'll notice you have two circles instead of just one floating out in front of you. The center circle works like before. It blinks as your weapon spools up, and then you maneuver your target inside of it until it turns red in order to get a lock. However, once you have a lock, you have a little wiggle room to maneuver. The smaller circle will stay locked on as long as you keep your target inside the big circle. This gives you a little flexibility to maneuver and allows you to aim the weapon a little bit and lead the target just like you would with your guns. In this example, the RB-24J missile is capable of radar slaving. You'll notice that with a radar lock, the smaller circle snaps right to the target as soon as the weapon is done spooling up. Not all missiles can do this, but if it can, this is what it looks like. Your radar is not guiding the missile, it's just telling the weapon where to point its seeker head before launching. Let's take a look from live gameplay.
Excellent.
So far, these infrared missiles have all been rear aspect. You need to be behind the target in order to lock on and fire. The last IR missile we're going to look at is an all-aspect weapon, meaning that you can get a missile lock without needing a clear line of sight to the engine exhaust. This example is the R60M, which has an Uncaged Seeker. This is an example from live gameplay. Next are semi-active radar homing missiles. This example is the AIM-7D. These missiles work by having your aircraft lock onto the target with its radar, basically pointing its radar dish directly at the target, tracking it as it moves around. The missile has a seeker head in it that detects the radar waves bounced off the target by your plane's radar system. The missile itself has no radar in it, it just detects the radar bouncing off the target. In order to use these weapons, you must first achieve a radar lock. If you need some more information about radar, radar locks, and radar tracking, please watch my other video about radar in War Thunder. I'll post a link in the description. Once you have a radar lock, hit your keybind for Fire Air-to-Air Missile. This will bring up the familiar gray circle out in front of you. It's different now, though. There's a second small circle just outside of it. This second circle indicates the strength of the radar waves being reflected off the target. It grows clockwise, and the closer it gets to a full circle, the stronger the signal. When the circles turn red, you have achieved weapons lock and can push the Fire Air-to-Air Missile button a second time in order to launch the weapon. You need to maintain the radar lock until your missile hits the target, which can take a while if you're making a long-range shot, so you have to learn patience to use these weapons effectively. The primary advantage is that semi-active radar missiles are all aspect. You can fire them at any target your radar can lock onto, so it doesn't matter what direction they're going relative to your plane. The primary downside is that this isn't a fire-and-forget weapon like an infrared missile. You need to babysit the weapon for its entire flight until it hits the target, which prevents you from maneuvering away and means that if you lose the radar lock for whatever reason before the weapon hits, you've basically wasted the shot. Here's an example from live gameplay.
Well done.
That about covers all the different types of air-to-air missiles currently implemented in War Thunder. I want to close out with a few notes and loose ends. First, weapon selection. If your plane has more than one type of missile, or you're carrying missiles and bombs or something like that, it's helpful to make sure you have the right weapon selected before firing, Otherwise, you might find yourself dropping bombs when you're trying to spool up a missile. Whoops! The keybind is Switch Primary Weapons, and you'll be able to see on the screen which weapon you have selected in your top left display. Next, some semi-active radar missiles in real life have advanced features beyond the capabilities I described here. Some have what's called a terminal homing phase, some have additional inertial guidance to make them more resistant to short breaks and radar locks, some planes can guide more than one semi-active missile at a time, and so on. As of making this video, none of those advanced types of features are present in War Thunder. Next, sometimes you'll find that a semi-active radar missile still hits its target if you lose a missile lock. This would be an hour-long video on its own. It's not impossible out in the real world in some situations with some radar sets in some radar modes with a lot of caveats. But generally, in War Thunder, this is generally considered to be a bug. Also, I want to mention active radar missiles. These are not in War Thunder, but probably will be eventually. Active radar-guided missiles have a miniature radar system in the nose of the missile itself, and with the help of your plane, the missile locks its own radar onto the target to guide itself in. Sometimes they act like a semi-active radar missile until they get close, and then turn their missile on for their own terminal guidance phase. If and when active radar missiles get added to War Thunder, I'll post a re-up of this video and add a section detailing their operation and use. Lastly, if you have any questions about radar, they might be answered in my video linked in the description detailing radar systems in War Thunder. Radar and missiles can be very complementary targets. Until next time, thanks for watching.